Hello everyone. I hope you enjoy listening to the story.
My name is Helen Brooks. I am 39 years old. My husband's son shoved a hospital debt worth $900, USD in front of me 3 hours after he died. They said if I truly loved him, I would sign it and leave peacefully. I signed immediately. 3 weeks later, federal agents walked into their inheritance party while they were pouring champagne. Arthur Brooks died at 4:12 in the morning after 6 months of cancer treatments, surgeries, and machines that never stopped beeping. I still remember the way his fingers slipped from mine inside that hospital room. Thin, cold, exhausted, for weeks. I slept beside him in an uncomfortable chair while his son stayed busy running his company downtown. Nathan visited twice during the final month. Kyle showed up only when cameras from the hospital charity board were around. But somehow, less than an hour after Arthur's heart monitor went flat, both of them suddenly appeared outside the ICU looking polished and prepared like businessmen arriving for a merger meeting. I had not even changed out of the sweater stained with Arthur's medication when Nathan guided me into a private consultation room near the billing department. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead while rain slammed against the hospital windows. My entire body felt numb. Kyle closed the door behind us and dropped a thick folder onto the table. "We need to settle some things quickly," Nathan said calmly. Loosening his expensive tie like this was another routine corporate discussion. Dad would not want legal conflict after his death. I stared at him without understanding. Grief made every sentence sound distant, like voices underwater. Kyle slid the paperwork closer to me. "The hospital expenses exceeded insurance coverage," he explained. "There is approximately $900,000 US remaining in treatment liabilities." My throat tightened instantly. Arthur's treatments had been brutal, but he always told me everything was handled financially. Nathan folded his hands together and gave me the same fake sympathetic expression I had seen him use on investors. "If you sign the transfer agreement, the debt becomes your responsibility personally. In exchange, there will be no inheritance disputes. Everyone can move on peacefully." Move on peacefully. 3 hours after Arthur died, I felt something crack quietly inside my chest then. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to change the way I looked at both of them forever. Kyle leaned back in his chair and sighed impatiently. "You already lived comfortably because of Dad for years," he muttered. "This is probably the cleanest solution for everybody." Nathan said nothing after that because he did not need to. The message was already clear. I was the second wife, temporary, replaceable, an outsider standing between them and their father's empire. Then I remembered Arthur squeezing my hand 2 nights earlier while morphine blurred his speech. He looked directly at me and whispered something strange. "If they ask you to sign anything, Helen, sign it." At the time, I thought the medication was confusing him. Sitting in that hospital room, staring at the debt papers trembling beneath the fluorescent lights, I suddenly realized he had known this moment was coming. So I signed. Immediately. Nathan exhaled in visible relief. Kyle actually smiled for the first time all day. They stepped into the hallway, calling their attorney before the ink even dried. I remained alone in the room, trying not to fall apart completely. That was when I noticed a black business card sticking halfway out of Arthur's folded coat inside the personal belongings bag beside me. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Agent Daniel Ruiz. My hand started shaking as I dialed the number from the hospital hallway. The man who answered sounded calm, almost unsurprised. "Mrs. Brooks," he said quietly, "we have been waiting for your call." I met Agent Daniel Ruiz 2 days after Arthur's funeral inside a quiet coffee shop overlooking the Chicago River. The city outside looked gray and exhausted beneath heavy clouds, which somehow matched the way I felt inside. I barely slept after Arthur died. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him lying in that hospital bed, struggling to breathe, while Nathan stood in the corner checking stock prices on his phone. Grief sat inside my chest like wet concrete. Heavy, cold, permanent. Daniel Ruiz did not look like the kind of man movies turn into heroes. He wore a dark coat, carried no visible weapon, and spoke with calm precision that somehow made everything feel more serious. He slid a thin folder across the table before saying a single word. "Your husband began cooperating with us 8 months ago," he said quietly. My fingers tightened around the coffee cup instantly. "Cooperating about what?" I asked. Ruiz opened the folder. Inside were photographs, bank transfers, corporate filings, and spreadsheets filled with numbers I barely understood. Nathan Brooks, Kyle Brooks, Brooks Medical Solutions, offshore shell companies, fraudulent emergency supply contracts, inflated cancer treatment invoices billed during the pandemic, millions of dollars moving through fake vendor accounts connected to overseas laundering networks. I stared at the paperwork until the words started blurring together. "No," I whispered. "Arthur would have told me if his sons were involved in something like this." Ruiz watched me carefully before answering. "Your husband tried to protect you from the investigation, but near the end, he realized his sons had moved too far beyond financial misconduct. They were laundering money through medical debt structures tied to terminal patients." My stomach turned violently. "Cancer patients?" Ruiz nodded once. "Including your husband's treatment accounts." For several seconds, I could not breathe properly. Arthur spent his final months connected to machines, while his own children used the system around him like a criminal pipeline. The realization hit me so hard I had to look away from the table before I broke down completely. I remembered Nathan arguing with billing managers during Arthur's treatments. I remembered Kyle constantly pushing paperwork toward Arthur while he was too medicated to focus. At the time, I thought they were trying to help manage expenses. God, I was stupid. Ruiz lowered his voice further. "The hospital debt transfer you signed is extremely important." I looked back at him immediately. "Why?" He slid another document toward me. "Because that debt was already flagged internally by federal investigators. Once inheritance liability transferred into your name officially, it triggered a mandatory audit review tied to all connected accounts." My pulse quickened. "Arthur knew that." Ruiz nodded. "He anticipated Nathan and Kyle would pressure you into accepting the liability quickly. He believed greed would make them rush the transfer process before realizing the accounts were under surveillance." I leaned back slowly, trying to absorb the full weight of what Arthur had done. Even dying from cancer, he was still protecting me, still thinking 3 steps ahead while his own sons circled his company like vultures waiting for him to stop breathing. Ruiz continued explaining the investigation piece by piece. Brooks Medical Solutions had secretly inflated emergency contracts with hospitals across 3 states. Nathan controlled the financial reporting while Kyle managed shipping records through fake logistics vendors. The fraud became massive during the final 2 years. Millions disappeared through shell companies disguised as urgent medical supply payments. Arthur discovered the irregularities after internal audits stopped matching vendor inventories. When he confronted Nathan privately, his son blamed accounting software errors. But Arthur had built that company from nothing. He recognized theft when he saw it. He agreed to cooperate after he realized the fraud involved organized laundering operations, Ruiz explained. "At that point, your husband understood his own company could collapse federally." I swallowed hard. "Did Nathan and Kyle know he was working with you?" Ruiz shook his head immediately. "No, they believed Arthur was too sick to investigate anything." That nearly made me laugh. Nathan and Kyle spent so many years underestimating weakness that they failed to notice their dying. Father quietly building a federal case against them from a hospital bed. Over the next 2 weeks, I played the role they expected perfectly. I moved out of the mansion without argument. I ignored inheritance discussions. I avoided reporters outside the funeral service. Whenever Nathan called pretending concern, I spoke softly and thanked him for handling everything. The performance disgusted me, but Ruiz insisted patience mattered more than anger now. "The evidence becomes strongest once they start spending publicly," he explained during one of our meetings. "We need visible transfers, luxury purchases, Celebratory behavior. That establishes intent and movement of potentially seized assets. Nathan and Kyle practically handed the FBI everything they needed. 3 days after probate filings began, Nathan purchased a black Bentley worth almost $300,000 US. Kyle posted photos online from a rooftop bar holding bottles of champagne beside captions about new beginnings. They fired Arthur's oldest employees quietly and replaced them with younger executives loyal only to money. One accountant who worked with Arthur for 20 years called me crying after security escorted her out of the building carrying cardboard boxes. "Your husband would be horrified," she whispered through tears. She was right. Arthur spent decades building Brooks Medical Solutions from a tiny warehouse operation into one of Chicago's largest independent medical suppliers. He believed hospitals should never exploit sick people for profit. Watching his sons turn that company into a laundering machine would have destroyed him even without cancer eating through his body. One rainy evening, Ruiz drove me past downtown Chicago while explaining the final phase of the investigation. Nathan had rented a luxury penthouse for an inheritance celebration scheduled exactly 3 weeks after Arthur's death. Investors, attorneys, influencers, and financial partners would attend. Public displays of wealth mattered to men like Nathan and Kyle. They needed an audience to witness their victory. The moment significant assets move during the celebration, federal seizure activates, Ruiz explained calmly. Bank accounts freeze automatically. Wire transfers stop. Then we enter. I stared out the car window watching city lights blur through rainwater. "Do they know any of this is coming?" I asked quietly. Ruiz looked straight ahead at the traffic. "No," he said. "Right now they believe they already won." That night, lying alone in my small apartment, I opened social media for the first time since Arthur died. Kyle had already posted the invitation publicly. Champagne glasses, skyline views, gold lettering across black marble graphics. Brooks' legacy era. I stared at the screen for almost a minute before something unexpected happened. For the first time since my husband's funeral, I smiled. The inheritance party took place on the top floor of a glass tower overlooking downtown Chicago, exactly 21 days after Arthur died. Nathan rented the penthouse for nearly $40, $000 USD a night, because subtlety had never interested either of his sons. The moment I stepped out of the elevator, I realized the entire event had been designed to celebrate not their father's life, but their own survival. Music pulsed softly through hidden speakers while waiters carried trays of champagne beneath crystal chandeliers, taller than most apartments. The city skyline glowed behind enormous windows stretching from floor to ceiling. Giant digital screens rotated through presentations reading Brooks' legacy ERA, beside photographs of Nathan shaking hands with investors. Arthur's face appeared nowhere. I stood near the entrance for a moment, gripping my purse tightly, while guests stared at me with carefully disguised curiosity. Most of them expected me to disappear quietly after signing the debt transfer. In their minds, I was already erased from the Brooks empire. Nathan noticed me almost immediately from across the room. He approached wearing a navy tuxedo and the same gold watch Arthur gave him after graduating business school. Seeing it on his wrist made something twist painfully inside my chest. "Helen," he said smoothly, kissing my cheek for appearance only. "I'm glad you came. You did the right thing signing those papers. Dad would have wanted peace." Peace. That word again. Rich people always rename cruelty when they need to sleep at night. Kyle walked over carrying 2 champagne glasses and handed one to Nathan while barely acknowledging me. "Honestly, this whole process went smoother than expected," he laughed. "No drama. No legal fights. Exactly how family should behave." Several guests nearby smiled politely. One woman actually raised her glass toward me, like I deserve congratulations for surrendering quietly. I took a slow breath and forced myself to remain calm. Arthur's final words echoed constantly inside my head now. Stay calm long enough to watch the truth arrive. The penthouse looked like something pulled from a billionaire fantasy magazine. White marble floors reflected gold lighting from the ceiling, while servers in black uniforms moved. through the crowd refilling drinks every few minutes. Nathan had hired a live jazz trio near the balcony overlooking Lake Michigan. Influencers snapped photos beside giant floral arrangements shaped into the Brooks Company logo. Investors laughed loudly near the bar discussing expansion deals and future acquisitions. The entire room smelled like expensive perfume and arrogance. Then Nathan climbed onto the small presentation stage near the center of the penthouse and tapped his champagne glass for attention. The room quieted instantly. "My father built an empire through discipline and vision," Nathan announced confidently. "Tonight begins a new chapter for Brooks Medical Solutions, one focused on innovation, growth, and keeping the company inside the bloodline where it belongs." Applause spread across the room. Kyle smirked beside the stage before adding loudly, "And thankfully, some people understood it was better to sign peacefully instead of dragging everybody through ugly legal battles." Several guests laughed softly. Nathan smiled without stopping him. That moment hurt far more than I expected, not because of the insult itself, but because Arthur would have been horrified hearing his children speak that way publicly. He spent years teaching them loyalty mattered more than wealth. Yet there they stood celebrating inheritance money, while his grave soil was probably still damp from the funeral. I walked toward the balcony, afterward needing air before my emotions betrayed me. Snow drifted softly across the Chicago skyline, while traffic lights glowed below like rivers of red and gold. I remembered Arthur standing beside me on that same balcony years earlier during a charity gala. He wrapped his coat around my shoulders because I forgot gloves that night. "This city makes people hard if you let it," he once told me quietly. "Promise me we never become those people." I closed my eyes briefly, fighting the sudden burn behind them. Then my phone vibrated. One message from Agent Ruiz. "We are in position." I slipped the phone back into my purse carefully while trying not to react. Across the room, Nathan laughed with investors beside a champagne tower taller than the servers carrying trays around it. Kyle stood near the bar showing somebody photographs of a yacht he planned to purchase in Miami. Neither of them noticed anything unusual yet, but the cracks had already started forming. 10 minutes later, one of Nathan's financial partners hurried toward him holding a phone against his chest. At first, Nathan looked annoyed more than concerned. Probably another transfer issue or delayed payment. But as the man whispered into his ear, Nathan's expression changed instantly. His smile vanished. "What do you mean unavailable?" he snapped quietly. Nearby conversations slowed as people noticed tension building around the center of the room. Kyle walked over immediately. "What happened?" Nathan lowered his voice. "One of the escrow transfers failed." Kyle rolled his eyes. "That is it?" Banks freeze temporarily during high movement all the time. He grabbed another drink and laughed it off. But less than 2 minutes later, 3 more phones started ringing across the penthouse almost simultaneously. One investor cursed under his breath while staring at his screen. Another woman stepped away from the crowd, speaking rapidly into a headset about frozen wire confirmations. Near the bar, somebody muttered something about federal review flags appearing on pending transactions. The energy inside the penthouse shifted so quickly it almost felt physical, like oxygen slowly disappearing from the room. Nathan pulled out his own phone again. This time, I saw genuine panic flicker across his face for the first time in my life. "No," he whispered. Kyle moved beside him, reading over his shoulder. "What the hell is this?" he demanded louder now. Guests nearby began checking their own accounts and messages nervously. Conversations dissolved into confusion. Music still played softly in the background, but nobody listened anymore. Then every television screen inside the penthouse suddenly went black. The jazz trio stopped playing mid-song. The elevator doors opened at the far end of the room, and federal agents stepped out one by one wearing dark jackets marked FBI across the chest. The entire penthouse fell silent. The silence after the elevator doors opened felt almost unreal. 1 second earlier, the penthouse had been full of laughter, clinking champagne glasses, and arrogant speeches about legacy. The next, Every conversation collapsed into frightened whispers while a line of federal agents walked calmly across the marble floor toward the center of the room. Agent Daniel Ruiz led them with the same cold composure he carried the first day we met at the coffee shop. Behind him came IRS investigators, financial crime analysts, and 2 federal marshals carrying sealed evidence cases. Nobody moved. Even the waiters froze beside their trays. Nathan recovered first, or at least tried to. He straightened his tuxedo jacket and forced a tight smile onto his face before stepping toward Ruiz. "There has to be some misunderstanding," he said loudly enough for the room to hear. "This is a private family event." Ruiz stopped directly in front of him and removed a thick folder from beneath his arm. "Nathan Brooks," he replied evenly. "This is now a federal seizure site connected to an ongoing financial crimes investigation." Every color disappeared from Nathan's face. Kyle laughed nervously from beside the bar. "Come on," he said. "This is insane. You cannot just walk into a private penthouse because of accounting errors." One of the IRS agents handed him a document without speaking. Kyle scanned the first page and immediately stopped smiling. His hands actually started shaking. Guests began backing away slowly as if financial fraud might somehow spread through physical contact. Ruiz turned toward the room and spoke with sharp clarity. "All accounts associated with Brooks Medical Solutions, Brooks Logistics Holdings, and affiliated shell corporations have been frozen pending federal review. No funds may be transferred, concealed, withdrawn, or redistributed effective immediately." The words echoed through the penthouse like gunshots. Somewhere behind me, a woman whispered, "Oh my God." Another investor grabbed his phone and cursed loudly after discovering his pending wire transfer had vanished from the system entirely. Nathan finally snapped. "This is harassment," he barked. "We have attorneys standing right here." Ruiz barely blinked. "Good," he replied calmly. "They can explain why terminal cancer treatment accounts were used to launder fraudulent emergency medical contracts." The room exploded into noise after that. Questions, shouting, panic. Guests rushed toward elevators while others desperately called banks and lawyers. One investor nearly knocked over a server while trying to leave the penthouse fast enough to avoid being associated publicly with the Brooks family. Meanwhile, the giant champagne tower behind Nathan still stood untouched beneath golden lights like some ridiculous monument to greed. Kyle suddenly pointed directly at me. "She knew," he shouted. Every head in the room turned instantly. "She signed those documents too fast. She was involved in this." His voice cracked near the end, exposing real fear underneath the anger. Ruiz looked toward me briefly before answering him. "Mrs. Brooks cooperated legally after inheriting flag liability transfers connected to federal surveillance." Nathan stared at me with open disbelief. "You knew the debt was poisoned," he whispered. I looked him directly in the eyes for several long seconds before answering. "Your father knew." That hit harder than any accusation could have. Nathan physically staggered backward like someone punched him in the chest. For the first time all night, the confident executive mask disappeared completely. Beneath the expensive tuxedo and rehearsed speeches, he suddenly looked exactly like what he really was. A frightened son realizing his father had seen through him long before cancer ever entered the picture. Ruiz opened another file and began reading specific charges aloud while federal agents spread through the penthouse collecting electronic devices and financial records. Fraudulent medical billing, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, false emergency, supply contracts, manipulation of terminal patient treatment accounts. Each charge landed heavier than the last. Several guests quietly slipped toward the exits pretending they barely knew Nathan and Kyle at all. Funny how quickly wealthy people forget friendships once federal agents appear. Kyle panicked completely after hearing the fraud counts. He grabbed his phone and attempted to smash it against the marble bar counter. But one of the marshals intercepted him instantly and pulled the device from his hands. "Do not make this worse," the marshal warned sharply. Kyle's breathing turned uneven. Sweat soaked through the collar of his white dress shirt while he looked around desperately for somebody to save him. Nobody stepped forward. Nathan tried a different strategy. He lowered his voice and approached Ruiz carefully. "Listen," he muttered. "Whatever misunderstanding happened here, we can cooperate financially." Ruiz actually laughed once at that. Not loudly, just enough to humiliate him. "Mr. Brooks," he said quietly, "you attempted to launder money through cancer patients while your father was dying in the same hospital system. There is no financial conversation left." The penthouse televisions suddenly flickered back to life behind them, displaying frozen account. Notifications from multiple banking institutions connected to Brooks Medical Solutions. Red warning banners spread across the screens one after another. Account restricted. Federal hold. Transfer denied. The room glowed crimson from reflected warning messages while panicked guests rushed for the elevators. It looked less like a celebration now, and more like a sinking ship filled with people trying to escape before the water reached them. Then Ruiz delivered the final blow. All inherited assets connected to Brooks Medical Solutions are now subject to federal forfeiture pending criminal prosecution. At that exact moment, one terrified investor accidentally crashed into the massive champagne tower near the stage. Crystal glasses shattered violently across the marble floor while champagne exploded everywhere in glittering waves. The sound echoed through the silent penthouse like a gunshot. Nobody moved afterward. Guests simply stared at the wreckage while golden liquid spread across the floor around Nathan's polished shoes. Honestly, the symbolism almost felt too perfect. Nathan looked down at the broken glass around him before lifting his eyes slowly toward me again. "Dad did this?" he asked weakly. I nodded once. "No," I answered softly. "You did this to yourselves the moment greed became more important than your father." For a second, I almost pitied him. Then I remembered Arthur barely able to breathe while Nathan argued with hospital accountants beside his bed. I remembered Kyle laughing about inheritance money before the funeral flowers even arrived. And just like that, whatever sympathy tried to appear inside me disappeared completely. Ruiz signaled toward the marshals. Federal agents began escorting Nathan and Kyle toward separate rooms for questioning while cameras from local media suddenly flooded the lobby downstairs after hearing police scanners mention financial crimes at the Brooks penthouse. The empire Arthur spent decades building collapsed publicly in less than 20 minutes. I slipped my coat on quietly and walked toward the balcony one last time before leaving. Snow drifted slowly beyond the glass while Chicago glowed cold and distant beneath the storm clouds. For a brief moment, I imagined Arthur standing beside me again with his tired smile and trembling hands. Even dying, he still protected me. Even dying, he still made sure the truth survived him. 6 months later, Brooks Medical Solutions no longer existed. Federal prosecutors dismantled the company piece by piece while forensic accountants uncovered years of hidden fraud buried beneath fake emergency contracts and manipulated hospital invoices. Nathan remained under federal indictment awaiting trial for money laundering and wire fraud. Every few weeks, another article appeared online describing new evidence against him. Kyle accepted a plea deal after investigators traced shell accounts directly to properties he secretly controlled overseas. The same men who once toasted themselves with champagne inside a luxury penthouse now entered federal buildings through side doors wearing wrinkled suits and expressions hollowed out by fear. I moved into a smaller home outside Chicago near the lake where the mornings felt quiet again. With the portion of clean assets federal investigators eventually released to me legally, I started the Arthur Brooks Cancer Support Foundation. We help families overwhelmed by medical debt and connect terminal patients with legal advocates before hospitals and corporations can exploit them financially. Every time I sit across from a frightened spouse clutching billing paperwork with shaking hands, I remember that awful hospital room where Nathan slid $900,000 of poison across the table and expected me to drown quietly beneath it. Sometimes people ask whether Arthur hated his sons by the end. The truth is more painful than hatred. Arthur loved Nathan and Kyle until his final breath. That was exactly why their betrayal destroyed him so deeply. Cancer weakened his body, but greed broke his heart. I saw it every night in the hospital when he stared silently at the ceiling after meetings with them. He already knew what they were becoming long before the FBI investigation started. And even while dying, he still tried to protect them from themselves. They simply chose money over mercy one too many times. The strangest part is this. Nathan and Kyle truly believed I was weak because I signed those papers immediately. They mistook calmness for surrender. They saw grief and assumed they could weaponize it. But greed has a way of making intelligent people careless. It blinds them. It convinces them they already won before the game even ends. In the end, the hospital debt they forced me to sign became the same document that triggered the federal seizure, destroying their entire empire. They literally signed their own sentence through arrogance. Arthur once told me something during our first year of marriage that I never fully understood until now. He said, "Money does not ruin people, Helen. It reveals who they were when nobody was looking." I think about that constantly these days. So tell me honestly, if your dying spouse looked you in the eyes and whispered, "Sign whatever they give you," would you trust them enough to do it? Or would fear make you fight back and destroy the only plan keeping you safe? And if your own family betrayed you for money, would you still believe blood matters more than character? Sometimes the most dangerous people are not strangers. They are the ones sitting beside you at the hospital pretending to care while secretly counting what they will gain after you are gone. Nathan and Kyle believed money would protect them from consequences. Instead, their greed exposed everything they tried to hide. In the end, the same papers they forced me to sign became the evidence that destroyed their empire. Arthur lost his battle with cancer, but he made sure the truth survived him. If this story shocked you, made you angry, or reminded you of someone in your own life, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more powerful family drama stories filled with betrayal, revenge, and emotional justice. And I really want to hear your opinion. If you were sitting in that hospital room, would you have signed the papers like I did? Or would you have fought back immediately and risked ruining the plan? Leave your answer in the comments below.